Well, good morning, everybody. I think you all know who I am, but for the one or two of you who may not, I'm Peter Fisk. I have the privilege of being Chief Executive and Chief Metrologist for the NMI. Thank you very much for coming this morning at this early hour. We very much appreciate it. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And I'd like to also extend that welcome to other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who may be present. So I hope you liked our misleading practice here with the roped off sections reserved. That section is reserved for people who aren't coming. But it's always been a problem to get people to sit down the front end of this lecture theatre. But we found a way. Well done, Yen, for that. So, happy World Metrology Day. World Metrology Day celebrates the science of measurement, and this year the theme of World Metrology Day and the subsequent year after that is measurements and light. Obviously a topic which is of crucial importance across the whole spectrum, if you'll excuse the pun, of human activity. From environmental measurements, environmental heat, climate change, the heat from the sun, to process control, to energy saving, energy efficiency of lighting devices. A very, very important subject and very, very topical. And I note that last year's Nobel Prize in Physics was given for the invention of the blue light-emitting diode, clearly an optical device. And in 2005, the Nobel Prize in Physics was given for optical measurements and optical spectroscopy. So it's also a topic of the highest international scientific importance. I'd like to announce two awards that NMI makes annually on World Metrology Day. These awards acknowledge and celebrate outstanding achievements in measurement and excellence in practical measurements by an individual or a group in the fields of academia, research or industry in Australia. It may be in the form of a single major contribution or a body of work developed throughout a career. The Barry Inglis Medal is the first award I want to talk about. It was named, obviously, in honour of the first chief metrologist for Australia, Barry Inglis, sitting down the front. I'll embarrass him a little bit more in a minute. The recipient of the 2015 Barry Inglis Medal is Dr. Graham Jones of St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. Graham's a chemical pathologist and has been awarded the Barry Inglis Medal for leadership at the national, regional and international level in a discipline or activity that involves the application of measurement science. He's made an outstanding contribution to the application of metrology in the field of chemical pathology, and you all understand the importance of getting pathology measurements right. The second award has a similar criteria for the candidate, but it is for a younger, earlier career person, and that is been awarded to Dr. Alessandro Rossi of the University of New South Wales for, and the citation reads, for groundbreaking work in nanoelectronics towards a quantum-based measurement of electric current, which will contribute to the redefinition of the ampere. He is working, among other things, on methods of counting individual electrons, which of course is the basic unit of charge and electric current. So we're here today to have a conversation and to engage in a conversation between two key figures in the national and international standards communities. As you know, NMI's functions and any National Measurement Institute's functions cannot be effective standing alone. We're part of an international and national standards and conformance system. In Australia, the Standards and Conformance System consists of NMI and Standards Australia, the Joint Accreditation System for Australia and New Zealand, looking at certification issues, and NATA, National Association of Testing Authorities, which is well represented here, who look at the accreditation processes for the knowledge and skills in the application of measurement and other technical and other activities. None of us can be effective without the other. Documentary standards cannot be effective without usually very often cannot be effective without effective measurement standards. And measurement standards cannot be effectively applied without competence and certification. So it's very, very relevant to have a conversation between elements of these bodies. So we have today Dr. Bronwyn Evans, who is the Chief Executive of Standards Australia. Bronwyn has over 30 years of experience as an engineering executive in the areas of power generation, engineering, education, standards creation and medical devices. She's been CEO of Standards Australia for about 2 years now, and she's also recently been appointed Chair of the Australian Government's Industry Growth Centre for Medical Technologies and Pharmaceuticals. She has previously held leadership roles at senior executive level in the companies Cochlear and GE Healthcare, and she's a Fellow of the Engineers Australia and Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. So welcome, Bronwyn. The other figure we have down the front here is Dr. Barry Inglis, who's the inaugural CEO of NMI, but before that had many, many years in CSIRO, being an absolute champion for measurement standards, beginning in the electrical area and then covering all of physical measurement in later years. He has 34 years of R&D management experience. He's the principal Australian representative on all metrological matters, and he's been a member of the International Committee of Weights and Measures, the peak body of measurement standards in the world, since 2000. And he was elected president of that committee in 2009 and re-elected in 2015. And that is the top job in international measurement standards. There is no higher role in that area. So we're very privileged to have an Australian in that role. We're very privileged to have a previous chief executive of NMI, and I'm very privileged to have one of my previous bosses in that role as well. So congratulations to Barry as on that re-election in particular. We're going to listen to a conversation chaired and moderated by Dr. Angela Samuel. Angela is the director of NMI's International Relations Office. As an NMI, and as we are the interface between the national and international measurement standards system, just as Bronwyn is, Standards Australia is the interface between the Australian documentary standards system and the international documentary standards system. And I could say the same thing of the chairs of JASANS and of NATA as well. Our international roles are critical. We, as an NMI, our role is to give confidence both nationally and internationally to the measurement systems made in Australia, and also to contribute to the development of international measurement standards. We do this under a number of pieces of legislation, including the National Measurement Act, and we also hold Australia's responsibility for Australia's activities and international contributions under the MITA Treaty, which is the international convention which adopts the international or the metric system of units around the world. Now, this conversation is going to be videoed with the permission of the participants, and I'm hoping that the video will be a very useful reference for those who wish to gain an insight into documentary measurement standards issues and other issues related to the interface between the national and international systems in those areas. And I certainly expect that my boss, Martin Hoffman, will be pleased to view this video. He unfortunately cannot be here today due to other commitments, otherwise he would have been. So at this point, I will hand over the forum to Dr. Angela Samuel, and I invite Angela and Barry and Bronwyn to come to the chairs here and to commence the discussion. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Peter, and everyone, happy World Metrology Day. As Peter mentioned, the theme this year is measurements and light, and we're choosing to interpret that theme with our conversation by using it to shed some light on the role of measurement as well as the broader standards and conformance infrastructure in addressing societal, or as we've increasingly called it in NMI, sectoral challenges in areas such as food, health, the environment, energy, etc. And we're very fortunate, as Peter has said, to have Dr. Evans and Dr. Inglis join us for the conversation this morning. So again, welcome both.
Thank you.
And I'd like to start, if I could, with you, Barry, and could I congratulate you as well on your recent re-election as President of the CIPM, which is the most prestigious position in international scientific measurement.
Thank you.
And ask you, if you could, to take us through some of the activities, the strategies of the CIPM, but more generally the international measurement community as well, in responding to these challenges.
Yes, certainly. They're grand challenges. Right, and I think I've got 3 minutes to respond or something. So
it's getting that way.
But I think every major economy is wrestling to some extent with these challenges. We at the BIPM, we've got about 70 staff. There's about probably 2/3 of those are scientists and technical people, and so BIPM and the CIPM are not going to solve the problems, but we do feel we have an active role to play in facilitating in collaboration. We've got something like 10 consultative committees in the CIPM, and the committees are comprised of experts drawn from all around the world, mainly from other national measurement institutes, also from Australia's National Measurement Institute, but also from universities and so on. I guess we have about 1,000 people or so on these committees, and so we really do have the top people coming to us, and so we have I think a base for at least exploring where things are going and being across. It's a forum for exchange, but each of these consultative committees we ask to address the big issues, try to identify the big issues in their fields, and prepare a strategy document for how they would address them, or how they think they ought to be addressed. And these were brought together and consolidated. We had a CIPM, finally, a CIPM document, and this was all bottom up.
Yep.
But then we sent it out to the chief executives, and we sent it out to government representatives, and we got some top-down input to it. And this has really formed the basis of what BIPM is going to do in the next 4 years. It's formed the basis of our work program that was taken forward to the General Conference in November of last year and have been adopted. So that's not really answering your question, because I'm not telling you what we're solving, but it provides the basis for the limited amount of research that we do at BIPM, but more particularly for how we can facilitate, how we can help draw some of the activities together, because I don't think anybody has the answer to these problems. I think we're very much in progress.
And I know that through the CIPM and the consultative committees, you've also increased your engagement, I guess, with stakeholders outside of the measurement community at the global level, in particular with the World Health Organization, the World Meteorological Organization, the medical community, etc.
Sure, these are ongoing in many ways, and we'll come back to this, because we, in a sense, are doing, or trying to do at the international level, what I suspect you people are trying to do here at the national level.
Sure.
But we do have an ongoing engagement. Once a year we have meetings with the ISO, with the ILAC and
Sure.
OIML,
Yeah.
and I mean all the bodies. We come together. But BIPM is in many ways a unique position in the metrology world, in that it does have entree into connecting with other international bodies, and so a lot of the World Health Organization, the World Meteorology Organization, and this is something we've been working on this hasn't just happened. I mean, this
Absolutely,
is something
yes.
we've been developing for many years, and this is where it comes about. I think it's an ongoing process, and I think we need to engage with international organisations, and at the national level, I think you need to do the same. You need to engage at all levels, and it's about trust, and it's about developing respect over a period of time. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to do that in the international level, particularly with World Meteorology. When we first started to talk to the WMO, they maintained their own pressure standards. They weren't SI, they weren't international standards, but that was the basis. And they had a network of laboratories, and all around the world, the climate monitoring and so on was based on these pressure standards. Well, we've got a champion within the WMO, and they've seen the light. And they think this is crazy for us to have an alternative system. They got no control over it, so they've come to SI.
Yeah.
And that's just an example. But
Absolutely.
this didn't happen overnight.
Sure.
This probably was 10 years in the happening.
So thank you, Barry. I mean, if I could bring this to you, Bronwyn, and extending on Barry's comments, of course, stands Australia, just like NMI, as Peter said, plays a leadership role at the international level as well.
Yes.
I wonder if you could bring us some of the insights that from the work of the standardisation community at the international level in responding to these societal challenges, and if you could draw out the lessons for Australia from those activities.
And thank you very much, and happy Metrology Day, everyone. It's very pleased to be here. As you mentioned, we're part of the international standards community, both at ISO and IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. So both of those groups play a very important role. And as we're seeing the demands of the community for a different range of standards, we're realising that you can't necessarily divide the world into standards that would come under ISO and standards that would come under IEC. We've recognised that there's a lot of work that actually requires those bodies to come together. Things like the Internet of Things, looking at big data analytics, looking at even smart cities, whatever that means. So the trend has been more to recognise that almost everything that we do in the physical world relies to some extent on electrotechnology, whether it's better use of resources, how do we get energy more sustainable, but it also requires potentially management systems or product standards. So one of the big trends is how do we bring those two worlds together? And it's an interesting challenge because the IEC is exclusively industry driven.
Right.
It's not government representation at all. And it's got quite a different culture and speed of doing things. ISO, on the other hand, is represented by the national standards bodies. So some of the trends are also how do we blend those cultures, which is a challenge everywhere.
Absolutely.
Every organisation has its own feel. But some of the other areas that we're looking at that we're starting to see people interested in includes nanotechnology. It includes electric vehicles. And I have to boast, but I was in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago on holiday, and I was delighted to see the electric vehicle charging booths on the side of the canals, and you just plug your car in and go away and let it charge. So it's becoming a reality already. Sure. And what we don't need, as an aside, is the world all having different ways to connect their vehicles to the electric charging units like we do with PowerPoints. Sure. So the challenge of standardisation is very real, and it's very immediate. So bringing the whole community along to understand what that means. I think the other challenge is for Australia to be an effective partner or an effective user of international standards, we have to be there contributing to international standards. Even when we object to a standard where we think it isn't needed, that's all the more reason we need to be there so we don't end up with an outcome that's not right for Australia.
Yeah.
And we see that being reflected in other economies too.
And I think that brings us to the recent initiative of the government announced in late last year, the Industry Innovation and Competitiveness Agenda. And one of the platforms for delivery of that agenda is, of course, the establishment of the growth centres. So we're just putting up on the screen the 4 outcomes that the Minister has identified against those growth centres, and I've printed them out so that you can reference them more easily. And I would like to start again with you, Barry, if I could, because in your domestic roles, you weren't only Chief Executive of NMI, you were also Chairman of the NATA Board and a member of the Council of Standards Australia. So could you give us some insights into how you think the Australian Standards and Conformance Infrastructure bodies can help deliver these outcomes and support the government's competitiveness agenda?
Sure. Before I do that, though, I'd just like to perhaps pick up on follow on from a point that Bronwyn was making. The Australian Standards and Conformance Infrastructure has a very high reputation internationally. I mean, Bronwyn mentioned ISO and IEC. Perhaps people are not aware that we had an Australian president of the IEC, Dick Brett, who was a chair of one of the standards committees that I was involved in early years. I think it was in the late 80s he was the president. Then we had Alan Morrison,
yep, sure,
who was the former chairman of Standards Australia. Yeah. We've got John Gilmore, who was the chief executive of NATA, was really the founding father of ILAC.
Absolutely.
And then we've had vice presidents of the International Organisation of Legal Metrology. Mm-hmm. And so we do have a very high standing, which we can build on, and we need to, in my opinion, maintain that. But just coming back specifically to the outcomes of the IGC, encouraging collaboration and commercialisation. I think it's a no-brainer. I think this is certainly what we need to do. I think in many ways elements of the infrastructure have been doing this for many years. I mean, one of the great advantages I see of interacting, if you serve on standards committees, you serve on the advisory committees of NATA, you're interacting, you have an opportunity to transfer your technology and your skills to other people in the area. And I'd have to say, working through NATA, it was a most valuable exercise because I think every time you go out on an assessment, you learn something and you transfer something. And this is about trying to encourage it. I think there's opportunities, if you're thinking about specifically of NMI, I think we have to maintain an element of research in NMI if we're going to continue to have any standing internationally. As Bronwyn mentioned, you need to be able to contribute at that international level. You need to have a seat at the international table, and you don't get that unless you're contributing. And so we need to be putting something in order to get that. And I think people shouldn't forget that there's nothing for nothing in this world, and if you're not making some contribution, then what right have you got? Where are you going to get your respect from? And so very, very important, I think, that we maintain a research component. Out of the research component, we're going to develop the reference materials, you'll develop new measurement techniques, you'll do new standards. All of these then are potentially available for commercialisation and instrumentation that comes out of it. And we've got many examples of that over the years. And I think that's an area where we can certainly build on. But through the various committees at all levels, this is not just at the top level. I think we've got to get people into the advisory committees, into the standards committees, because this is the workshop, this is the floor, and this is where the things really happen. And so I'd encourage that. So you want me to go through?
Well, I mean, if you could just globally, for example, reducing the regulatory burden is something that we at NMI are very focused on as well. So.
The regulatory burden, if we're going to go into areas of ultimately self-declaration, if you want to go down that path, this is often seen as a very good way of shedding regulatory control and regulatory costs. In order for that to work effectively, you need to have an effective standards and conformance infrastructure. If you haven't got an established and understood set of standards to work with, if you haven't got confidence in your measurement capability, if you haven't got credibility in that area, if you haven't got measurement standards, you haven't got traceability of measurement, then you've got no basis for this. You're going to have random people, you're going to have problems all over the place. And so I think if we're going to go down deregulation, which is an area where I think we can really make a lot of savings, I think we need to ensure that the underpinning infrastructure is there to enable it to happen.
Yep.
I think the other aspect too is that when we think about, if you go down through these, you think about tapping into the international chain. We do really need to, I think there are two sides to it. We're going to be manufacturing, whether it be in food processing or whatever it is, we need to have credibility internationally in order for us to tap in to the export chains and link in. But just as importantly, in my view, is that we need to have an effective infrastructure in Australia to ensure that we don't become a dumping ground for inferior product. And this is a it's a serious issue. Some years ago, in the electromagnetic interference area, we at this place were aware of the development of international standards, the IEC standards that were being developed. We approached a number of manufacturers and tried to engage their support for us to get funds to establish new standards for Australia. They didn't want to know because they saw this as a cost burden. We don't need these new standards. Don't come to us with them. Mm. We knew they were coming, and of course they did come. And then we're suddenly impacted, and we had people knocking on the door. Well, we want to get this. We need to get credibility in this. We need to get, otherwise we can't export. We ended up with some inferior products coming into Australia that we were able to pick up because we had the capability in Australia to know the standards, to have the measurement capability, and to have the measurements that had the integrity. Mm. And so. I think that's there are a number of points that. Yeah,
and they're great examples, and I'm hoping that we'll bring out in the discussion some more about the also the international recognition, how that helps reduce technical barriers to trade, which also ensures or supports industry competitiveness in the global market. But for now, I might shift on to Bronwyn as well. In your role as well, recently appointed chair of one of the growth centres, as well as being Chief Executive of Standards Australia, how do you see the standards and conformance bodies as being able to help these growth centres deliver these outcomes?
Thank you. Look, I think there's a number of ways, and I'll pick up on one of Barry's points. You need strong standards and you need a strong compliance system, if you like, and that can require education, but it absolutely links with the ambition to improving the capability to be part of the global supply chain. Yeah. Interesting, you talk to any number of companies, they recognise that perhaps Australia isn't going to make products end to end, but we can be a very effective part of a global supply chain. Whether it's transmission systems for automotive, we don't need to be making the whole car in Australia, but we have really unique capability in some areas, or medical devices. And equally, we'll be using components from the global supply chain in our own products here in Australia. And I think it is that ability to make sure we're using international standards so that we have got a way to understand and trust what's going to become part of our own supply chains. And it was interesting, yesterday I was speaking with the chair of the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and he was saying that in the consultation that he's done to date, that in fact measurement standards were proving to be a competitive advantage for Australia, because we have the ability to really understand what we're doing. And he's found when companies are engaged in advanced manufacturing, they're more likely to be on a growth path. So we're already seeing examples of that strength of what Australia's doing is being translated into opportunities for growth, for export, and in a whole range of areas. Medical technologies, fire doors. So a really nice, we've got quite a nice broad range of products in Australia. I think the other opportunity when we look at the reduction in regulatory burden is the role of standards as an alternative to black letter law. If you look at any regulatory spectrum, you can do everything from public education through to self-regulation and co-regulation, right through to legislation. But standards have a real role to play as an alternative there to reduce that burden and really empower industry to also build capability. So it starts to address quite a number of those areas which the growth centres are looking to work on. One of the first areas listed there is that collaboration between the research sector and industry. And if you look at the concept of the technology readiness levels that first came out of NASA, it is that area in the middle, that sort of 4, 5, 6, after you've done the research, before you sort of get to the go-to-market. And that seems to be the area where we need to strengthen in Australia. Some countries have very good examples of doing that. And so what can we learn that isn't necessarily taking an overseas solution and trying to retrofit it, but what are the principles that will help us transition from technology readiness levels 1, 2, 3 through to 8, 9 in a way that really helps us get across that sort of what's often termed in medical devices the valley of death, because unfortunately it is for some companies.
Yeah, sure. I am about to go to our colleagues in the audience because I'm conscious of the time, but I have one last question if I could, taking the liberty of going to the big picture if I could, because of all of your experience jointly between the two of you. I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you both why you think a country should invest in a national standards and conformance infrastructure. I think you've probably brought some of that out already, but more specifically, and this time if I could start with you, Bronwyn.
One of the things that is our mission is to bring internationally aligned standards that contribute to innovation and productivity in the national interest. So Australia will have some things that are very unique. If I think about the built environment, our geology, our climate, our cultural practices mean that we need to have standards that are very applicable here. And we've got a lovely example in Vanuatu where we're New Caledonia, sorry, the other country. My team were just going, wrong country in the Pacific. In New Caledonia, where they're using Franco-French standards. And I tell you what, they don't need snow loading for their built environment. But they do need wind loading. And so they've seen that the standards that we've got in Australia are applicable to them. So the reason we need a strong national standards and conformance system is that we make sure whatever we do, it's applicable for Australia and allows us to trade globally. So our ambition is to adopt international standards as the starting point, but always to ask the question, is there a reason why Australia needs to have either its own standard or one may not exist? For example, the standard on IT governance, which is now an international standard, started in Australia because we recognised it didn't exist. And it's a very key thing for corporations to have IT governance. So there'll often be times where there isn't every standard out there in the world. We'll identify that gap. We've got another one coming up on cross-border data flows. That's going to start in Australia, but I suspect that will become something that's needed globally. So there'll be opportunities for us to identify where standards don't exist, but most importantly, whatever standards that we do take on as projects are always in the national interest. That's really how we work.
Yeah, of course. And Barry, from the measurement point of view as well.
Yeah, but if I could just add to that, because I think the activities in standards that go on in Australia, we're not only looking at areas that are not covered internationally, but as Bronwyn said earlier, it's absolutely vital that we have an effective role to play in the development of the international standards. If we're going to adopt them, then we really need to have a say on what's in there. And you're only going to be able to have people who can contribute at that level through an effective standards body domestically. And as I mentioned, Dick Brett, he wasn't the chairman, but he came out of the it was a product of the standards activities we have in Australia, and went all the way to become the head of the IEC, the chair of the IEC.
Sure. Yeah.
Why do we need to invest? If we want to maintain a developed economy, if we want to protect ourselves, as I mentioned before, about not becoming a dumping ground, if we want to be able to adopt the advances in health and medicine, we've got to have an ability to be able to contribute. If we want to pick up on new innovation, whether it be in the nano area, if you can't measure it, you're not going to be able to control it. You're probably not going to be able to use it. And it just seems to me self-evident that we've just got to have an effective system. We need international credibility. And once you've got this, you don't keep it without continuing to pump it up.
Yep.
And there's a continuing effort in the international area for accreditation. The competence issue is fundamental. It's an ongoing thing to have results of product tested in Australia accepted internationally. And this can only be done if you've got credibility in all aspects of this. And it's sometimes a very difficult equation. People sort of say, well, where's the money you're earning? I mean, that's the true test of whether you're any good or not.
Yes.
Well, in the National Measurement Institute, our mission has really been to get the skills out into the workplace. It's no good having a first-class international recognised national standards laboratory if it all lives in here. Because what we're really trying to do is to get it out there. And this is a high-energy source of technology transfer and support for technological development. And I think, if you think about investment, it's a very small price to pay if we confront some of the major challenges that could hit us. Sure. If we're not able to test about incoming product, if we're not able to tap into these international lines, if we're not able to adopt the advances in health and so on,
yep.
and climate. I mean, these are all things that we're only going to be able to do by having a capability, innate capability within this country.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can measure it by sort of saying, well, what's your calibration earnings? Because this is not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to become a major test house. We're trying to get it out. While I've got the soapbox off,
Go for it, Barry.
I'll just continue on. One of the great advantages, I think, we have from participating in each other's activities in the infrastructure is that it does open doors. I think if I look at NMIs around the world, the big institutes, they've all got, and Standards Australia and NATO, they've got boards, they've got councils, they've got advisory committees, they've got input from their stakeholders. And one of the problems I think we have these days in the National Measurement Institute is that we don't sort of have that directly, we do it indirectly. And I always found an enormous advantage in having an active role and having the staff having an active role in these other bodies. Because, first of all, you interface with other members on the committee, but certainly at the council you get to meet all sorts of people at the council meetings. On the NATA board, we used to move the board meetings around Australia, and we would have lunches, and you would invite high-level people from the state governments and federal governments. You had an opportunity to interface with these people. And I think one of the things that we don't do well in this country is to take advantage of this very effective standard conformance infrastructure that we have from a point of view of attracting investment. And I've spoken to state government people, and they almost had never realised the value that this can be to investment or for a company coming in. And I've spoken to Japanese companies, and they say, well, if we don't have that, we've got to essentially redo it. And that's a very significant cost to us to invest in a company. So I think we've also got to try to get it out there so that we can sell the advantages of investing in this country, because we have a very effective system. But we're only going to keep it if we keep investing in it.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you.
And I know that we're going to be taking up these suggestions within NMI, certainly. And we are doing more of that engagement with the broader stakeholder environment through something that we call our sectoral approach. So I'd like to, at this stage, open the conversation up to the audience and bring in some of that activity as well into the discussion. So I do invite questions, comments, suggestions from you. And if I could ask you before you ask your question, if you could please introduce yourself. And I think we have a question from our health sector area to start. There you are, Kerry. If you could introduce yourself firstly. Thanks, Kerry.
So I'm Kerry Emsley. I manage the bioanalysis group at the National Measurement Institute, and I've got a question for Bronwyn. One of the objectives of the Growth Centre program is to facilitate connections between the industry growth centres and enabling capabilities. The example that they use in the proposal is in the ICT area. But we can also see that metrology is an enabling technology. So from that point of view, I'd like to find out your views as to how you think we can most effectively build the connections between the Technical Infrastructure Alliance and the industry growth centres.
Thank you. So I'll just take a step back and give you a bit of a perspective where we're up to on the Medical Technologies and Pharmaceuticals Growth Centre. We're actually in about week 2 of our consultation process, and we've got an 8-week consultation process. So I think that's one of the questions we'll be working on. In fact, how do we get, and not so much the growth centres, because per se the growth centre is going to be 5 people, but through the growth centres, how do we make that connection between the technical infrastructure and industry in particular? Because it is through industry we're going to benefit. And I'm very pleased to have been given the opportunity to take on one of the chair roles, because I'm going to be a bit of a tyrant when it comes to talking about standards and the technical infrastructure, because I understand the benefits it can bring to a company, specifically a medical device company, as that's my background. So it'll be making sure we inject those concepts when we have forums, when we have workshops, and when we're talking to individual companies about how do they build their capability. Again, going back to the conversation I had yesterday with the chair of the Advanced Manufacturing Industry Growth Centre, from his consultation, he said one of the areas that companies are identifying when they look at the one around enhancing workforce skills is not that they can't find them in Australia, but they can't afford to have an expert in all the areas they need. What they'd like to do is share that capability across companies, perhaps in a cluster. And I think that expertise in using and implementing standards, in being regulatory professionals, in understanding measurement, is a skill set that we could start to say companies could share this. Companies wouldn't need to have individual experts. So that's some of the opportunities we'd look at as we start to talk to the sector. What is it that you need to be successful in the global supply chain, to be successful in Australia, keeping in mind with something like 1.2% of the world's population, if a company is going to grow and be successful, it's the other 98% that is really our oyster, if you like. So I think it is making that connections for companies. How do they get the benefit of the technical infrastructure through their workforce in creative ways?
My name's John Loki. We're supposed to introduce ourselves. I'd say that for 17 years I've been the CSIRO representative on Standards Australia's Committee on Lightning Protection.
Thank you very much.
And this being a year of light, I think lightning might be the topic. I have been very proud to be on this committee. It's a superb committee, and I've been very proud to be associated with the Standards Australia documents, 1728, originally written by Prof Prentice of University of Queensland, followed up by Prof Darvanese. These documents internationally have been a real outstanding, highly respected document. We have been told, questioned by Standards Australia, why do you need an Australian standard at all? Why don't you just adopt IEC? Lightning's the same the world over. We don't need you. Well, they haven't said it quite as strongly as that, but I'm highlighting the the roles I think Standards Australia can play, which I think is extremely important, and I'm very proud to be associated with it. But maybe you have some comments on that.
Well, thank you very much, John. And first of all, I'd like to thank you in particular for your contribution and clearly passion for the standards around lightning protection. I think there's a couple of things. While I am an electrical engineer, lightning protection and its characteristics isn't one of my areas of technical expertise. And in fact, that's one of the key principles we have when we have project managers working on any committees. We have active, at any one time, 500 committees. We cannot have experts that in the 500 committees. We are experts in the process. So when we look at revising a standard, we do a couple of things. We always, and I think it's very appropriate, we always ask the question, is there a relevant international standard? We are not the technical experts. Our process then says when all of the stakeholders agree that there is a need for either an adoption of the international standard with changes or an Australian standard, then the experts are the ones with broad stakeholder support who will make that decision. We manage the process. If you like, our competitive advantage is the process. Our contributors, and of which we have 6,000 odd, are the GEMs who make the decisions for Australia on behalf of a broad range of experts. And I think that strength in our process has really demonstrated and proven time and time again is an important thing for us to protect. We cannot be the technical experts. And I can't comment on the specifics of 1728 or the mining protection, but they're the principles that we work with. So thank you very much for your comment and your interest. And I think that's just an explanation of how we operate in the world. We're certainly part of the international community of standards. We're very clear that we'll manage the process. We're also clear that Australia will adopt international standards where that's appropriate, and where it's not, we'll look at what are either the modifications on behalf of Australia or an Australian standard.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. And I think there's a question over here. Yes.
I'm Eugene Salol from Value-Based Access, a boutique consultancy in the market access space here in Sydney. And my question is to Bronwyn. Bronwyn, you made a particular point of saying that the Industry Growth Centre is very keen to try and fill the gap between 1, 2, 3 and 9 and 10 in the commercialisation process. And my question is that we do some fantastic things here in Australia in terms of new devices, for example, which is my particular interest. The issue is that quite often these wonderful medical technologies aren't affordable. And I wondered whether, as part of your remit, you take this into account when you're thinking about advising Australian industry about commercialisation of their products, whether you drop in the thought that perhaps they need to consider whether or not this fantastic thing, the bionic eye or whatever it happens to be, wonderful though it is and filling a need though it might do, mightn't actually be affordable from a commercial standpoint because countries can't afford it, or they've got a particular demand for what we call, as you know, health technology assessment, which involves cost effectiveness issues and so on. Because some of the technologies that are being developed here in Australia wouldn't actually pass muster in Australia. They wouldn't be affordable here in Australia. They wouldn't be paid for either through private health insurance or our other systems.
So thank you. Thank you, Eugene. It's one of the many elements of the sort of the whole ecosystem around, in particular, devices. Certainly what I saw with the cochlear implant and I looked back at the history plus the time I was there, sometimes the very first product you make will not be the final one, and you need to go through the evolution of continuous improvement, continually improving your production processes so you can always get the cost of production down so that you can make your product more ubiquitous, more affordable. So I think it is always a challenge when you're starting to make those bespoke products, that very first device where, yes, it will be expensive, but finding a market, finding a way to have the device used so that you can continue to improve your product If you wait until you've got the perfect product at the right price point, I suspect that all your great ideas will have been commercialised somewhere else. So you have to be part of that journey, and I think that is one of the challenges. And I was speaking with another research group yesterday, more in the built environment, that sometimes it's a question of money. It's pure and simple. How do you keep firms going in that period where they need to take those ideas when the product might start off quite expensive, get them through the production improvements to the point where they have a product that is affordable? And while doing things and getting them available in the Australian market is a great idea, we are about 1.5% of the world's consumption of medical devices. So you've still got the opportunity to find the markets where perhaps your product can be used or become part of another supply chain. So I think it's helping companies also think about, how do we look beyond our shores? Again, we're about 25 million people. That means there's about 6.something billion others where we could also be finding a way for our products to be part of the supply chain. Thank you.
Thanks, Bronwyn. And I think we've been focusing quite a lot on the health area, so I am going to ask if I could just take the opportunity to ask one of our people in the environment group, Gavin, if you could ask a question from your point of view as well. We'll come to others. Hopefully we will have time for everyone. Thanks, Gavin.
Right. I'm Gavin Stevenson. I run the Ultra Trace laboratories and also look after the environmental sector engagement. And my question is actually a construction industry example, and it's related to Bronwyn's comments about the deregulation spectrum. And in the construction industry, there's been some examples recently of where there's been a problem with the regulation of products rather than the actual measurement and compliance. And things like the installation of infinity electrical cabling that's got cracking issues, and there's the use of non-compliant combustible cladding that contributed to some apartment fires down in Melbourne, and poor testing of soil before putting down slabs that's led to big issues down in Melbourne. And these are problems where there's not a measurement issue and there's a standard in place, but is there more that the measurement and standards community can be doing to increase the uptake of these by the regulators and the suppliers?
Barry, would you like to comment on this to start with?
I think it again goes hand in glove. I mean, this is about the uptake of the standard. Is it a cost factor, the cost of looking at the soil and so on, or is it just a capability? I mean, I haven't quite got the full.
It just doesn't seem to be done.
It's just not being done. If people are not going to do it, eventually it's going to go to some sort of legal issue. It's not clear to me what more you can do except engage with the accredited laboratories. You know, I think we've got to try and make the accredited laboratories have got a big role to play to try and get that message out that we're available, we can do it, we can provide it. We've got the NMI's role, of course, is to underpin it with whatever soil testing requirements there are, but if people are not going to comply, then I think it does come down to a legal issue. I don't know, Bronwyn, what's your...
So I think you raised a couple of separate issues. One was the infinity cables. The other was the cladding that was recently also implicated in a fire. And sometimes products are not fit for the purpose they're used for. So they can be perfectly fine and they're misapplied. So there, in terms of what can we do, I think working with groups like the Australian Building Codes Board, which is a creature of COAG, and then working with the states and working through the industry associations. So part of it has to be our advocacy. How do we all take responsibility for talking to everyone about standards and conformance and not have them roll their eyes in their head and go, really? But demonstrate why it's an important part both for economic efficiency, for safety, and for a whole range of other reasons about quality and quality of life. And I think some of those examples that you've used are products being misapplied. And I think Barry's right. If someone misses a step in a process like soil testing, then I don't think you necessarily can or would want a large regulatory and set of inspectors going around on every job. It wouldn't be economically viable. So how do you get that education back so that no one would think of missing a gap like that? Because in the end, it will cost them money. So follow the money a bit and make them see up early, because what you do at the beginning of a project will save you often 10-fold to 100-fold in remediation at the end of a project. So we all have a responsibility to be out there advocating on economic grounds. It's always a good one when you're talking to someone about what the costs are if you don't do it, and then what are some of the burdens if you don't do it. So the benefit and the cost, I think, is our responsibility. But there are bodies that we can work with, and certainly we are, and I'm sure NMI are as well, like the Australian Building Codes Board. So as they're educating the practitioners in the industry about what's important, some of those messages are just in there all the time. And I think they're good examples of why we need to make sure the message is work it out yourself, because if you don't, someone else might do it for you, and that's often when you don't want their help.
But having said that, I think with the best will in the world, we can do all that, but you're always going to get people who seek to bypass the system. And there are some people who believe that we don't need accreditation, we don't need regulation. You know, it'll be self-fixing. You know, if you build a car park and it falls down, okay, you know, you won't do it again, will you? Because and this is, in fact, you know, I shouldn't go into it, but some fairly high-level people have challenged me about the value, for example, of accreditation and measurement, because the free enterprise system will take care of itself in this regard. Well, you know, I think this is not the society that we want to live in if we're going to go down that path. So I think what Bronwyn's saying, we can do all we can and engage with the various parts, but if someone's really going to buck the system, then that's the price they pay, I guess.
It's Damien Fisher from Standards Australia. I guess we're very fortunate to have a very good standards and conformance infrastructure here in Australia, and I guess just drawing on what Dr. Evans has mentioned earlier, I just wanted to get a sense on any interesting new projects that Standards Australia is involved in at the present moment, and really what are the benefits for stakeholders being involved in that work?
Excellent question, Damien. Thank you very much. I'm so pleased you asked it, because I've got the answers in front of me. Look, I think there are some really cool things that we're doing, not just electric vehicles, not just the Internet of Things, but there's some work we're doing around DNA measurement technologies, and there's some long-term work around genetics, which is one of the things. And some of the other areas we're working on is nanotechnologies. And we've got a technical committee, TC229, which is linked with the ISO work on nanotechnologies. And yesterday I was actually at a really cool laboratory that Lend-Lease is funding in the city, near Sydney University, looking at a whole range of things. But they had a prototype of a solar cell that had nanoparticles on it. So as the light comes in, it actually focuses the light onto an array at the bottom, and they're getting a much more efficient solar cell that could eventually be used as window glazing. And that's the sort of challenges and the sort of applications that are really exciting, just changing the way we think about the built environment. You know, you just chuck a window in. Well, maybe now you put a window in that's also a solar cell that's very transparent, and you don't notice some of those things. So I think the world around nanoparticles is really exciting, and there's some of the projects that we're working on, and I think that opportunity for stakeholders in the NMI community to be part of those standards committees is a really good opportunity of bringing us together in a formal sense in creating those standards as well. So thanks for the question, Damien.
You've given me the opportunity to mention that some of our NMI staff in senior roles in delivering on our sector activities are unavoidably not here today, because they're at international or domestic engagements, and that includes our section manager in nanometrology who's attending the ISO TC 229 meetings in Prague this week.
We've set that up.
We've set that up, that's right. I am conscious of the time, so I'm hoping that Peter will have the opportunity to raise some of the NMI work in this area as well in his closing comments. But I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Bronwyn and Barry for their comments this morning.
Thank you, Bronwyn and Angela and Barry. I've been given the challenging task of summing up, apart from anything else, and what I'm taking away from this is the interdependence of the documentary standards and the measurement standards, and the fact that they're very strongly industry-driven, scientifically driven and community-driven. There is a trend around the world to unite in addressing major challenges in microphones, addressing major challenges which are common to all nations, such as the health and environment, energy consumption, and other things like that. And that is driving a bringing together of the international standards organisations. We've heard that the CIPM and BIPM are engaging more closely with the World Metrology Organisation, and that, for example, ISO and International Standards Organisation, International Electrotechnical Commission are recognising the need for them to work very closely together to produce results that are more useful to the world in addressing these big challenges. We've heard that standards and standards conformance are not a burden, but they in fact reduce costs by having by giving a level playing field, by giving confidence and giving infrastructure that everybody can use. And they don't have to be in regulation to be effective in that. They're becoming increasingly part of the due diligence of organisations, where as they reduce their risk of things going wrong, they use the international standards and the national standards and conformance systems to do that. We've heard that a strong standards and conformance system is essential for Australia to be part of the global supply chain, both on the import side and on the export side. On the import side, protecting us from importation of inappropriate product. On export side, by giving confidence in our clients and international traders in the quality of Australian products. We've heard that it's essential for both I can't read my writing here. We've heard that it is also essential, standards conformance is an essential component of the path from invention and innovation to application and commercialisation of products, crossing the so-called valley of death. And I think another thing that comes across from here, in an environment where we have a government which is very focused on deregulation and as reducing the cost of regulation and government to businesses, they are also focused on using trusted international standards. And we've heard today that that's what this is all about. What NMI does is adopt trusted international standards. We have the trusted international standard here, at the head of CIPM, and in Bronwyn's case, the trusted international standards of ISOs, and we contribute to the quality of those. And on the rare occasions when Australia needs something better than what is available internationally, we develop it. And very often it becomes part of an international standard anyway, so we're ahead of the game. And finally, it's really, really important to understand that trusted international standards of any sort are not much use unless we have the infrastructure to use them. The expertise, the training to use measurement standards, and there's training to implement documentary standards, and the accreditation so that people have confidence that we're using them correctly, are all absolutely essential for this to be part of it, for this to be effective for the Australian economy and the prosperity of Australians. You can't take the international system separately from the national system. You can't take the accreditation part of the Australian standards conformance system separately from the documentary standards or the measurement standards or the certification system separately, and have them working independently if we want it to be effective. They need to work together, they are interdependent and all essential. So NMI tries very, very hard to deliver the outcomes it needs, that Australia needs in the area of measurement standards, and Angela mentioned a number of them, and Barry and Bronwyn did as well, especially in the very relatively new areas of measurement standards as they apply to nanometrology, a very, very difficult area of science and metrology, but very important for a number of reasons. They span the area from environmental issues, from health issues to industrial issues, and again, and also support documentary standards and are supported by accreditation and certification. So I think I'll leave it there. I could talk longer if I had the time, but we don't. I'd like to finish by thanking Angela and Barry and Bronwyn for the conversation. I'd like to thank again and Angela for the concept of this meeting today, and I'd like to thank Nolene Grogan and Lewis Gambra and everybody else who contributed to this. These things don't happen without a great deal of effort behind the scenes, and they don't run well unless people have put a great deal of thought into it. So thank you to all of those people, thank you to our speakers, and thank you for coming this morning. And let's thank our speakers again.